Greetings, dear friends. It is our sincere pleasure to welcome you again. Today we will converse with the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Igor Mikhailovich, our viewers were certainly greatly impressed by the topic of controlled rebirth, which was discussed in the previous video. And of course, a lot of puzzle pieces fell into place, including those relating to historical personalities who were fascinated by the mystical side of Buddhism. Hence, questions arose, in particular, when you said that nowadays there are a lot of schools and branches in modern Buddhism. And unfortunately, what Gautama Buddha gave has been lost. So today Buddhism is sort of an easier path, a path of attaining the state of peace, creation of a glade, or formation of an active subpersonality. Thus a question arose: what is the situation with the main and key concept in Buddhism, such as the achievement of the state of Nirvana, the state of liberation from this cycle of rebirth?
Well, this is actually an interesting question. Although I should say that not everything is so simple regarding Nirvana. If not so long ago, the concept of Nirvana denoted attaining peace. A person gained a state where nothing is happening, and he doesn't even identify himself in any way. I would compare it to achieving a state of a sleeping subpersonality, and this was actually called the state of Nirvana, meaning the simplest and the easiest state. Later on, they started complicating things a little bit. It became a practice to understand the state of Nirvana as a person abiding in a certain state, like on a glade, as we discussed. Then they expanded the concept to merging with the Absolute, with omniscience. This is such a state in which a person becomes a part, I would say, of the whole universe, or a part of the consciousness of the whole universe. This will probably be closer. And later on, already in recent times, it became a fusion with a deity. However, the concept of deity still denotes the Absolute, that is, a kind of information field of our planet. Therefore, everything is not that simple here. What Gautama was talking about, well, if we speak in understandable terms, Nirvana is a state of divine love. In other words, it's not just enlightenment, but it's an attainment of the state of immortality, meaning life. What does enlightenment give in Gautama's interpretation? It's actually an aspiration to help all living beings, because love and respect for other people and care for other people as for himself awakens in a person. This is a natural state. Meanwhile, what does the state of enlightenment give in the modern understanding of Buddhism? Idleness. I mean, there is an illusion, and that's it, and there is no desire or aspiration. I'll say even more, friends. There are secret interpretations, and their teachers say that it is disregard of other people. That is, another person, especially if he's not enlightened, is regarded merely as garbage, as a leaf on a tree, as something living. That is underfoot, it is worthy of respect because it has life. But at the same time, it has nothing to do with you. In other words, there is a gap, you see? That's a paradox.
Interesting.
But this is what their teachers talk about. It is certainly interesting, but it's wrong. Meanwhile, there is also a concept of the state of a Buddha, which is something different. Yet nowadays, it is all somewhat mixed up in Buddhism. There are so many interpretations of this state of Nirvana that I really think they themselves are already confused about what the state of Nirvana is. But on the other hand, this is understandable. Why? The state of omniscience gained, let's say, by a person who is engaged in or practices Buddhism is really tempting. Why? Because it's a practical experience. In fact, there are many practices in Buddhism that give a person a taste, let's say, of other states and other capabilities. And this mystical Buddhism is filled, well, not with mysticism, but with phenomena that a person can develop in himself owing to Buddhism. For many people, this is really tempting. It's like magic. For instance, let's take Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet in America, a famous soothsayer who predicted during his sleep. He was sleeping and making predictions. People asked him questions and he answered them. There are a lot of myths about him, but there are a lot of really interesting facts about him too. His predictions were accurate. He pointed out the place where certain things were stored, where to go and what to do. People did that and really got the result. Question: how could the man know this? And the answer is very simple. It is the freedom of secondary consciousness. In other words, being part of the Absolute. Our secondary consciousness naturally knows everything about the material world, but not about the divine world. It is precisely thanks to his subpersonality and secondary consciousness that Cayce was able to contact the so-called Absolute, hence his omniscience and understanding. So a person being in special meditative practices, when his work is aimed at freeing secondary consciousness, or let me put it more correctly, it is the disconnection of primary consciousness and the contact of a humanist personality with secondary consciousness. It is in this state that a person gets such a tremendous perception. When you can answer any question, you know it. You know how the world is arranged, starting from the elementary level and ending with the planetary one, let's say. You know everything about everybody. You know everything the system knows. Sort of the internet. It's not that you have access to the internet, but you yourself are the internet. And this state of omniscience certainly captivates people. However, there's a paradox here. When Cayce woke up, he didn't remember anything. Why? A simple question. Because yes, secondary consciousness was active, but primary consciousness was actually excluded from this chain of cognition of this world, and his answers to the questions he was asked while he was asleep. That is why he didn't remember anything when he woke up. Subpersonality is also an active consciousness, being part of consciousness. Thanks to this he knew where various things were located and so forth. After all, again, it's a projection to that very astral plane, or the unified information field. Indeed, in this case, it happened thanks to that very subpersonality when it took over, but it was actually secondary consciousness, and he entered through secondary consciousness, whereas if primary consciousness was active, he would remember what he was saying. And since he didn't remember, excuse me, this is proven by empirical evidence, isn't it?
It doesn't matter through whom, but omniscience is given by this very absolute, right?
Exactly, by the demon. What we call the devil is actually the absolute. That's the point.
While those are just intermediaries.
Well, those are already intermediaries. No, I wouldn't say they are intermediaries. Secondary consciousness is a part of this world, but it is your individual one. Primary consciousness is also a part, but it is your direct assistant. However, if it becomes your boss, that's where a problem is. Therefore, it's important that primary consciousness doesn't become your boss. Otherwise, it's worse than being under a thumb, to be honest. It's already forever. A person who does these specific practices, as long as he is in that state, he can really answer any question to himself. But the paradox is that when he comes out of that state, all he remembers is that he knew this, but he cannot answer the question. And it is interesting that monks who were seriously engaged in achieving this fusion with the Absolute, with omniscience, they could speak any language while being in that state. Indeed, tell me, what language does our modern internet not know? It becomes like a neural network.
Yes.
You know, such a conductor of a neural network. Of course, this is very revealing and very tempting. It's very tempting for primary consciousness, but not for personality. And that's where the paradox is. Why do we actually forget? Well, firstly, when a person comes out of practice and primary consciousness has been switched off, it has no access to that information which a human as personality observed, while being in fusion with secondary consciousness without primary consciousness. Meanwhile, our primary consciousness fulfills the function of working memory.
Of such critical thinking.
Of course.
Yes, exactly.
And here a paradox arises. that personality has some understanding, but cannot transmit it. Why? Because primary consciousness was not connected. But it's impossible to perform this practice with primary consciousness, because it's a limiting factor, let's just say. If primary consciousness is subordinated to secondary consciousness, certain phenomena arise in this case, I agree. Then a person remembers all these phenomena, but it's impossible to get into a deep state of freedom of secondary consciousness while being with primary consciousness.
And what are the benefits to primary consciousness if it doesn't remember anything, if it didn't participate in this process?
You know, this is a paradox of madness. I won't call it otherwise because primary consciousness benefits from such states. And do you know what the benefit is? The benefit is that a human as personality acquires a state of subpersonality. Merely that. Yes, primary consciousness doesn't know, it doesn't have the information that a human as personality has received. However, a human as personality cannot use that information either. He cannot even recall it. Why? Because when we are in a natural, wakeful state, it is primary consciousness that is responsible for memory and our emotions, not the secondary one. Secondary consciousness gives us pictures, understandings, and many other things. I mean, it's the intellectual component of a human. As for what is emotional and living, our memory and our desires, that is nothing but primary consciousness. That is why, when a person turns off his primary consciousness and is in fusion with secondary consciousness, and he calls this Nirvana, he attains a state in which he doesn't want anything. Indeed, there is no desire and no aspiration, there is just all-encompassing knowledge. You are like a part of the universe, you are like the essence of this universe. Naturally, it is pleasant for a person. It's just that when he comes out of this state, he loses it, because primary consciousness switches on. This is such a simple phenomenon, but it is very exciting, and it urges people to practice all their lives and tune in to becoming a part of that absolute, while in fact, this is nothing but real death, meaning absolute death, or the second death, or to put it simply, annihilation of personality and the two consciousnesses. The soul departs while the person actually dies, and it's already irreversible. It's not even a state of subpersonality. And look how interesting Buddhism actually is, if we approach it not from a practical point of view, but rather from a cognitive one.
Yes, exactly. If we study it.
If we approach Buddhism from a perspective of a person losing his way in broad daylight because of his desires, his egoism, and his aspiration to become someone or something during his lifetime, while still here.
Pridefulness, to become a part of something big.
Sure, of course.
Of this very omniscience.
That's how it turns out to be. Again, what pushes a person to become a subpersonality? It is clear with a sleeping one, that's an easy path. Gautama spoke about it back in his time. But again, even Nirvana doesn't give the state of a Buddha, because the state of a Buddha means the management of this process. You see, it's a state in which a human can influence matter, I'll put it carefully. Whereas the state of that Nirvana is not the state of a Buddha. In other words, it is deception, or self-deception, I'll put it this way. However, it is very enticing for people. In general, people are tempted by magic, by power, by something sort of realistic which you can touch and can use. Meanwhile, what does secondary consciousness give? An illusion.
An altered state of consciousness.
Of course, again, let's take the management of an illusion. It is extremely tempting for people, because a person is able to evoke any illusion in himself. I mean, he doesn't need to go to the seaside, he can capture it all for himself as something already experienced, as if he has already arrived from the seaside. And that's it. And Buddhism gives such an opportunity to a person to acquire a realistic illusion that he would like to get. Skills cannot always be obtained, because a skill has to be worked on, whereas a sensation or a feeling, as if you have experienced something, is just a management of an illusion, I'll put it this way.
This is what you said about the glade, in particular.
Absolutely right.
About this state.
I just wanted to say the same thing. It's a creation of a kind of enclosed space for yourself, where you'll be after death of your physical body. It's a glade. You know, I would compare it to your chamomile, on which a bug is living. Do you remember, friends? We once talked about this. It's also an illusion, but it is real. So in this case, a person spends his entire life trying to feel like a bug on a chamomile, or to put it simply, to exist in an illusion he has invented on some confined glade. Just note, in the previous videos we discussed the states and at least a path that is prickly
Yes, exactly.
and unpleasant.
Yes.
But ahead of you there is
Silky grass.
silky grass, and this grass expands to infinity there. This is an associative description of what a person attains by embarking on the path of gaining real life after death, life, and not an illusion of life, whereas an illusion of life is limited. That is, a person turns out to be like a fish in a small aquarium, in his fantasy, and it is limited by his energy structure, no more. I mean, there are literally 1.5 steps and that's it, and a person is indeed like a fish.
Such a small area of the glade.
Right.
An aquarium.
He will never be able to expand it, but on this glade he can reside in a state of peace, or he can turn himself into an active subpersonality. But this is something different. It's a mystical branch of Buddhism. Yet what does an active subpersonality mean? It means that a person accumulates powers in himself. He studies technologies of influence on other people's consciousness as well as on personality. In other words, imagine what a powerful illusion a person is able to produce in himself, that it becomes material and real for other people, similar to the way Kanduks do it. And Buddhism also explored this. Yes, this technique, let's say, of working with illusions existed much earlier and far long before Buddhism was formed. But Buddhism adopted it. In other words, it absorbed a lot of magic, a lot of various practical techniques. Again, I'll emphasize, why precisely the practical ones? Because it is something that gives a person an opportunity to actually feel and gain those skills. If it is the right and pure spiritual path, a person notices such transformations in himself that he is not gnawed by resentment. He gets rid of it. There is no heaviness inside. Why? Because he has forgiven everyone who offended him. It becomes easier for a person to live, and most importantly, it becomes a pleasure for him to live because he himself generates love for the spiritual world, and when he begins to receive it in return, well, this is already indeed the path of an alive human being. When he feels love coming from the spiritual world, meaning he understands that God begins to love him, and this is the attainment of happiness in life. It is all that the spiritual path gives to a person while he is in the body. Naturally, a person also learns to control his consciousness, meaning it's a constant struggle, constant work and constant control. There's a struggle only at the initial stages, but later on a person realizes that it is pointless to struggle. It's impossible to defeat the Absolute, especially using the same tools that our consciousness uses. It's unrealistic. But it is realistic to reject that which is bad, evil, and wicked in oneself, this negativity that oppresses us and makes our life really unbearable sometimes. Thus, by embarking on the path of gaining life eternal, a person is purifying himself from the inner filth. I cannot describe it in any other way, you see. In other words, it's when a person really becomes alive inside. And the most important thing is that God's love emerges in him. Yes, this is not just pleasant, but it is also something alive. However, a person can realize this when he actually becomes free of his physical body. That's when other capabilities open up. But as long as a human being is under the influence of the two consciousnesses, his perception as personality is also limited by the information supplied from secondary consciousness, as well as demands and desires from primary consciousness. In other words, he exists as personality, purposefully, attaining life, God's love. Yet, under constant attacks from Satan, if we speak in religious terms, I mean a person cannot escape this anyway. But when he becomes free from Satan, he understands something completely different. Why is it hard for a person to realize during his lifetime that he has gained life? He won't understand. It's a A little bit different, of course, when a person embarks on the path of service, when he gains those skills, or, as they say in Buddhism, the state of a Buddha, meaning a higher level of development. That's when it becomes clear for a person. It's already a different case. But if a person simply gains life, or the state of enlightenment, as they say in Buddhism, at least that's what Gautama said, this is not quite clear. You understand that you cannot live without God's love, even for an instant, because it becomes the only
Meaning.
value and the only meaning of your existence. This is already the dominant image of gaining life. As for everything else, you perceive and appreciate it because neither love nor respect for people disappears. On the contrary, you begin to appreciate love for your other half. You really begin to appreciate and understand it. You understand the value of family. You realize the value of friends, of those who live like you by spirit alone. You understand that all the people in the world are actually closer than relatives and friends. You know, this is like a reflection of one person in many mirrors, where his appearance is distorted but the essence remains. The same is in this case. There comes a different understanding that only consciousness divides us, and it is our own consciousness that spoils our life here. It has such a function, and it becomes clear too. Yes, it is easier and simpler to live, but again, a lack of understanding appears as to why others do not live this way, you see. And regarding yourself, you also forget very quickly why you haven't always lived this way.
Yes, exactly.
Well, these are nuances that give a person an understanding that he is actually developing, in any case, that peace and that love, by the intensity of that love and the impossibility to part with it, even for an instant. This is exactly the indicator of life. While in Buddhism, you see, it's a little bit different. The state of enlightenment is perceived there as understanding of manipulation, understanding of the illusion that our consciousness forms. And when a person is in such an all-encompassing state of perception and understanding of these illusions, I emphasize illusions, friends, not life. There is no love in him, but there is a calm perception of the world in him. And to attain that peace and understanding of how illusions rule the world and that the whole world is an illusion, that is called the state of enlightenment, you know. It's funny, why? Because it is nothing but the dominance of secondary consciousness over personality.
Kind of idleness, yes.
The paradox of madness. There's no other way to put it. To spend one's life on becoming a slave of shaitan, is it worth it? To lose one's way in broad daylight, yes, I understand that there is beauty in Buddhism too. At least is the attainment of peace. It's really good. Why? Because an active subpersonality is not only dangerous to a human as personality who has lost life. For him, on the contrary, an active subpersonality, I mean, if he becomes an active subpersonality, it's a winning option for him. Why? Because he can take someone else's life. He can enter a cycle of rebirths, a controlled cycle. But it is limited anyway. Time passes so quickly. Moreover, when a human becomes a subpersonality, he understands that it is, you know, like a game. You are given an opportunity to dominate a little bit in this world, but then you are punished to the fullest. A person actually realizes that, and what does it bring him? Inner heaviness. An understanding of the finiteness of this rebirth that manifests itself in him. And again, when he still was a personality during his lifetime and developed those abilities in himself, those very illusions seemed eternal to him. While in the state of subpersonality, he realizes that these illusions are falling apart, and with every rebirth he becomes closer and closer to annihilation. But annihilation means death. It is that abyss and that darkness all subpersonalities fear. This is a natural process.
That's a way out of the chain of rebirth through annihilation in the system.
It's a way out. That's exactly what they talk about. That Nirvana is a way out of the chain of rebirths. Not through gaining life, but through dissolving in a deity, as some adherents of Buddhism say nowadays, while others say it's a fusion with the Absolute, with the mind, that is, dissolution in an illusion. I'll put it this way. Isn't this absurd? Therefore, friends, there is nothing better than life. Life is given to a human exactly for him to gain life eternal. You know, say, we have lived, we have tried something. Yes, certainly, if you enjoy living in delusions, in illusions, well, is this really life? If a person lives without love, if a person doesn't live, enjoy inside himself, that's not life, it's torment. And sooner or later, any torment ends. But if a person abides in love, happiness and joy, here during his lifetime, and does everything he can to intensify this love in himself so that it prevails and is preserved in him, then it will be preserved in him. Everything is very, very simple. But our consciousness strives to complicate everything. This is actually the paradox of madness, of how susceptible we are to temptations from our consciousness, how ready we are to change our lives, to spend time, our priceless lifetime, on acquiring just another illusion. Is that really wise? I'll give you another simple example. Literally yesterday, the American conference, Global Crisis, America at the Crossroads, was held. In addition to all other interesting information, whoever didn't watch it can do that. The 4 green zones were discussed there, which will last much longer than the rest of America, so to say. And again, I have repeated it many times today, it's a paradox of madness, but it's indeed so, friends. You'll see for yourselves that most people will begin to take care of digging some kind of a shelter in that green zone for themselves, instead of building the creative society. People are busy with anything, building an illusory territory or micro-territory for themselves where, like that bug on a chamomile, they would exist for millennia. They are busy with all sorts of things, merging with a fantasy, with an illusion, but not gaining life. Tell me, are we actually sane? It's a paradox. Indeed, it's a paradox. Why? Because many people who are currently living and performing various practices of this kind do not understand the elementary simple thing that even those very green zones, yes, they can last even for a year longer than all other territories. A year is a long time. When it comes to life, every day plays a role. And we can understand such people too. But, my friends, if we really fail to take countermeasures against the climate Cerberus, and fail to do our best as people to save this planet and human lives, then excuse me, all vessels will disappear. And it is pointless to create glades, because there will be no vessels, so there will be no place for this glade. In other words, it's a global state or a rebirth into Nirvana, not into life, not into illusions, but into Nirvana, in other words, into nowhere. Does it make any sense, now, during the end times, to engage in something that has no prospect? And the paradox is that people fail to understand simple things, while at the same time they stubbornly try to listen to their consciousness. Yes, nothing will happen to consciousness, let's put it this way, but I mean to the absolute, to that which is prevalent throughout our universe. Of course, the loss of one sphere doesn't play a role, but for us, for all of us living here now, it plays a huge role. Why? Because this sphere is our territory, and it is possible to go beyond this sphere, perhaps only through Nirvana. But is it worth taking such a step? I believe it is something worth thinking about before embarking on such a path. You know, it is sad, to be honest, it's a little bit sad that people put so much work and effort into gaining an illusion. What for? When you can gain life. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends. Peace be with you, and God's love.